I've been trying to do the research and write the script for days, but I simply can't get my head around it. I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm mentally running on a hamster wheel, trying to coordinate 10 things at the same time while simultaneously constantly coming up with new ideas, while simultaneously exposing myself to the point where anxiety will eat me alive. I can't stop projecting this vision that people are laughing at everything I do, thinking that my work is absolutely irrelevant. And I want to hide. I want to delete every bit of myself that exists online. Delete every account. Stop applying, stop pitching, stop competing for opportunities and just... I don't know. Maybe I should have done something else with my life. I mean, AI is going to f*** us all up anyway, so why am I even trying? I just wish someone would have told... Hello there. Many of us in the creative field feel this mixture of existential dread, disappointment, anxiety, general confusion about the state of the world, and the unmerciful pressure various systems are placing on our artistic practice. And it's heavy. I'm sure you're going through the tides as well, questioning everything and looking for something, some kind of certainty to hold on to. For a while now, I've been trying to answer this question. How do you build a sustainable artistic practice without constantly trying to reinvent yourself? Because when I look around, I see a lot of talented people burning themselves out, trying to be more productive, more visible, relevant, and original. So I want to dedicate this time to this wonderful tapestry of complex forces we are all probably navigating in one way or the other. Productivity, creative burnout, perfectionism, audacity, transformation, exposure versus visibility, and uncertainty. For a very long time, I thought that being creative meant coming up with new ideas, which sounds perfectly reasonable until you actually try doing it. Because if being creative means constantly producing new ideas, then eventually you start looking at yourself like a mine. You keep digging, trying to find the next thing, the next concept, the next project, the next version of you. And after a while, you start feeling depleted because you've convinced yourself that the only ideas worth pursuing are the ones you've never had before. And it certainly doesn't help that many of the systems we work within reward novelty, speed, and constant output. I've met extraordinary musicians, extraordinary visual artists, people whose skill completely humbles me, people who have spent years studying, practicing, refining their craft, and yet many of them rarely release anything, if at all. And I know for a fact that this is not because they aren't talented or unwilling to work, but because at some point, the conversation stops being about the craft itself and starts becoming about authorship. I know a pianist, an incredible pianist, the kind of person who can sit down at a piano and make you cry, because the way he speaks through his instrument is just, I can't even find the words for it. He practices, he performs, he's amazing. And yet when it comes to releasing his own music, he can't, because he would have to answer a question that for some reason he is not able to answer. What do I have to say? The moment you stop interpreting someone else's material and start presenting your own, you become accountable for your choices, your taste, your perspective, your voice. And that's terrifying. That's exactly where I got stuck at one point. Because every time I sat down to create something, I felt this pressure to come up with something completely new, something original, something that would justify its own existence. But the strange thing is that while I was busy searching for new ideas, I was already surrounded by so much material. I just wasn't looking at it that way. I have notebooks, a lot of notebooks, and inside those notebooks are fragments, half-finished poems, single sentences, observations, questions, Tiny bits of something that felt important enough to write down, but never developed into anything. For years, I looked at those notebooks as evidence of failure. Evidence that I couldn't finish things, that I wasn't disciplined enough. And then a few years ago, as I was going back to those fragments for the 100th time, which I used to do as self-punishment, by the way, some of them connected to something relevant to me in that moment. And I realized those fragments were not dead matter. They were puzzle pieces. Those notebooks stopped feeling like a graveyard and started feeling like an archive of possibilities. And actually, that's one of the reasons this video exists. If you're new here, this is part of my Behind the Music series, where I explore the ideas behind the tracks from my debut EP Liminal. Usually, these videos end up being less about the music and more about the questions that led me to writing it. And the same goes for Soave, the new track from my debut EP. If you are someone who's already found a sustainable system that supports your artistic practice, I'd love to invite you to share something about it in the comments section. If not, you might find yourself where I was a few years ago, thinking that the goal of creation is reinvention, which is exhausting, because eventually you'll realize that you've spent years trying to look for new ideas while completely ignoring the clues that were being scattered around you. The strange sentence written on a receipt, the half-finished poem, the melody recorded at 3 in the morning. And even though there are artists who are or were constantly reinventing themselves, whom I absolutely admire, like David Bowie, for example, there are also many artists who are transforming their material. Take American filmmaker David Lynch. If you've seen enough of his films, you start noticing the same themes appearing over and over again. Identity, dreams, doubles, hidden worlds beneath ordinary reality. These are found in different films, different characters, different stories, but they always relate to the same obsessions. Or French-American artist Louise Bourgeois. She spent decades returning to memory, childhood, and family, because she understood that some questions are deep enough to spend a lifetime with. And then there's Zima Blue, one of my favorite episodes from Love, Death and Robots, based on a short story by British science fiction writer Alastair Reynolds. The whole story appears to be about expansion, achievements, and ambition. But in the end, it turns out to be a story about return, about discovering that the thing you were searching for was there from the beginning. That episode hit me like a truck, because that's exactly what I was doing. I was constantly looking for the next thing while sitting on top of years of unfinished material that already belonged to me, which brings me to something I find deeply fascinating. German biologist and philosopher Andreas Weber argues that creativity is not something that separates us from nature. It's something that connects us to it. Life itself is constantly transforming. Nothing appears out of nowhere. Everything emerges from something that came before. Things combine, adapt, mutate, evolve. And maybe ideas aren't all that different. American science writer Steven Johnson writes about something called the adjacent possible. The idea that new things rarely emerge from nowhere. They emerge from what already exists. One thing opens the possibility for the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. That feels much closer to how my own work actually happens now. Through collisions, fragments meeting other fragments, ideas meeting memories, memories meeting questions, questions meeting experiences. And eventually, something starts taking shape because I stayed with it long enough to understand it. That's why I no longer think the biggest challenge is finding ideas or doing the work. The bigger challenge is learning how to work with the ideas we already have. And I think this is where a lot of us get into trouble, because the economic system we live in doesn't particularly reward staying with things. It rewards production, output, visibility, frequency, and consistency. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to reduce every creative struggle to mindset, because material reality matters. Time, housing, and health matters. Making a record costs money. Making a film costs money. Printing a book costs money. Even having enough free time and mental space to think costs something. There are incredibly talented people whose work never reaches the world, not because they lack courage or ideas, but because the conditions around them make creation extraordinarily difficult. So when I talk about perfectionism, authorship, exposure, or creative burnout, I'm not suggesting that everything can be solved through a change in perspective. I'm only talking about the parts of the process that we may actually have more influence over. Of course, sustainability isn't only a creative question, it's also a practical one. Different artists and creatives solve the problem in different ways, through commercial work, teaching, grants, collectives, commissions, day jobs, or a combination of all of the above. That's probably a conversation worthy of its own video. Having said that, the algorithm, the music industry, clients, curators, audiences, and sometimes even our own ambitions are always asking, what's next? What are you posting tomorrow? What are you releasing next month? What conversation are you inserting yourself into? And those aren't inherently bad questions, but they are very different from the question that artistic practice often asks, which is, what am I still trying to understand about myself, about the world, about my medium? So even once we've found material worth working with, there is still another obstacle waiting for us, and it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Because in all the conversations about creativity, productivity, discipline, consistency, and artistic success, we tend to assume that the hardest part is making the work. Today, I would argue that the hardest part is being exposed. I know a visual artist, one of the sweetest people I've ever met. A person with a very clear visual language, a very clear point of view, a person who absolutely has something to say. And yet, whenever the possibility of putting her work into the world appears, she can't do it. Because suddenly, there is something at stake. Judgment, rejection, misunderstanding. She's afraid of being visible. Or maybe visibility isn't the right word, because I believe we are talking about exposure. Because exposure and visibility are actually two different things. Visibility is about being seen. Exposure is having something at stake when you're seen. A person can be extremely visible and barely exposed, and someone else can be almost invisible and feel completely exposed. You can spend 20 years executing work for clients and remain relatively protected. The brief was theirs, the vision was theirs, the direction was theirs. But the moment you put your own name behind something, the moment you say, this is mine, everything changes. And that's where perfectionism enters the room. Because perfectionism is often disguised as professionalism. It sounds responsible and thoughtful, and sometimes it is. But perfectionism is often just fear wearing a very sophisticated disguise. If the work is never finished, it can never be judged. If the album is never released, it can never fail. If the painting stays in the studio, nobody can reject it. Perfection becomes a moving target. Always one more revision away, always one more course away. And meanwhile, life keeps moving. What's interesting is that the people who do eventually put work into the world are not necessarily the most confident. Confidence and audacity are not the same thing, because confidence is believing in yourself, and audacity is acting before that belief is fully formed. And if there's one thing about artists who constantly make things and release things and continue growing, it's not that they're fearless. It's that they've somehow made peace with uncertainty. Or at least, they've learned how to move despite it. Which brings me back to something that has been bothering me for years. The internet has convinced many of us that visibility is the goal. More followers, more reach, more engagement, more impressions. And before anyone says, Well, I don't care about social media. Are you sure? Because even those of us who barely post are not immune to it. How many times have you landed on someone's profile, looked at the numbers sitting at the top of the screen, and instantly made assumptions about their relevance, credibility, or success? How many times have I done it? The strange thing is that we often don't even know whether those numbers are real, inherited, inflated, purchased, or simply the result of a completely different context we don't even know about, and yet they still influence us, not always consciously. And I think pretending we're above it is often less honest than simply admitting that we're living inside it, one way or the other. But this specific kind of attention is not the same thing as meaning. And visibility is not the same thing as connection. Because I've seen people with enormous audiences feel completely disconnected from their work. And people with tiny audiences create things that genuinely impact other people's lives. So maybe the question isn't, how do I become more visible? Maybe the question is, what kind of exposure am I willing to tolerate in order to make the work that matters to me? Because the truth is, there is no version of authorship that comes without exposure. Even British street artist Banksy, who built an entire career around anonymity, didn't eliminate exposure. He just redistributed it. The person became hidden, the work, the ideas, and the statement remained exposed. Something was still at stake, and this is incredibly interesting because it suggests that there isn't one correct way to be an artist or creative. There isn't one correct way to be visible and to participate. The problem is that many of us spend so much time comparing ourselves to people whose practices have absolutely nothing to do with our own. And we don't stop to ask ourselves, what actually makes sense for me? Not for the algorithm, not for the industry, not for the trends, for me. How do I want to work? How do I want to show up? How do I want to communicate? How do I want to be seen? Or not seen? Because sustainable artistic practice isn't about finding the perfect strategy. Maybe it's about finding the strategy that allows you to continue the work. And that's why I've stopped treating those notebooks as evidence of failure. Because when I look at them now, I see a conversation I've apparently been having with myself and the world for years. And maybe that's what a body of work actually is, an ongoing relationship with a handful of questions that refuse to leave you alone, each time asking to be understood from a slightly different angle. What strikes me now is how many of those fragments I almost abandoned because I didn't think they were original or important enough. And maybe that's also true for us in general. I was talking to a friend the other day who works as a therapist, and I asked her, if you had to boil down the struggles of most of the people you work with into one recurring theme, what would it be? Without hesitation, she said, not feeling like they're enough. And that answer is huge, because maybe that's why we're spending so much time worrying about becoming successful, relevant, and visible, that we rarely stop to notice that we are already in the middle of a transformation, not a dramatic one, a slow kind, the kind that happens while you're living, while you're making things, while you're making mistakes. So before asking yourself what you should make next, ask yourself a few different questions. What keeps returning to me? What idea, image, question, or memory refuses to leave me alone? But also, what do I already have? What skills, what resources, what connections are already available to me right now? What kind of work can I realistically sustain? How much exposure am I genuinely willing to tolerate? What kind of support system do I have? And perhaps most importantly, what kind of artistic practice would allow me to continue creating 5 years from now? Because the goal is not to become an endless production machine. I think the goal is to build a practice that can survive uncertainty, comparison, and self-doubt. And maybe that's what sustainability really means. Learning how to work with what is already there instead of constantly extracting more from yourself. Because creativity doesn't always begin with invention. It can begin with attention. If any of the books, films, or artists I mentioned sparked your curiosity, I'll leave a reading and watching list in the description below. Also, let us continue this conversation in the comments. I've been talking to a lot of artists and creatives who seem to be standing at a similar crossroads, trying to figure out how to navigate many of the things we've touched upon in this video. Two heads think better than one. Thank you for spending this time with me. And as always, stay safe and remember, truth may be hard to swallow, but peace cannot be built on an empty stomach.